Welcome back. This video is part of a series on the basics of texturing in Maya and in Photoshop. In this video, we will be taking our UV layout that was created in the last video, saving out a snapshot of it, and beginning to build the diffuse texture map in Photoshop. To do this, I will need to first select the objects that I want to export, open up my UV texture editor, and in the UV texture editor, once I'm happy with the layout that I have, going to the Polygons dropdown and choosing UV Snapshot will open up the option for me to save out this layout as an image. In this case, since I've set my project folder, the image will be default placed in the Images folder. I'll go ahead and change the name from OutUV to OutUV Crate so that I know that it's specific to this object. And in this case, I would like to make a 1024 by 1024 texture. Just as a reminder, anytime that you are creating textures, you will want to keep your textures square and keep them in powers of 2. Other options, color I will be changing in Photoshop, and image format I would like to use a PNG so that I have access to the transparency. Otherwise, all other options I can leave as default, and I can go ahead and hit OK. And I should have an image in my project folder. The image that has been created should look something like this. Now from here, if I go ahead and I open up Photoshop, I can import this image and begin my texturing process. First thing that I want to do is clean up this image so that it's a bit easier to work with. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this layer UVs so that I have a good idea of what this layer is. I'll go ahead and make myself a background layer, for now, of just a solid black. And from here, I will take the UVs and change the hue and saturation, which if you want to is under Image, Adjustments, and then Hue and Saturation, or Control U. I will go ahead and put this fully up to 100% plus 100 lightness so that any of the color variation in the original image is removed. If we take a look at what it is originally, there's a bit of a white to gray gradient in here, and I want to have it all one solid color. As well, I'm going to go ahead and do this one more time, and I'm going to choose to colorize it, set up my saturation to 100%, set my lightness to -50 so that we get some color in it, and then I'm going to choose a bright color that will stand out from my texture, and because I'm going to be working with wood, which would be in the warm tones, I'm going to choose a bright green so that it will contrast from the background. Now this texture that I have will not include the UV layout. This is simply something that I can use to guide where things are going to end up. When creating textures, organization of your workspace is just as important as it is in Maya. If you're working in a studio environment, there are often times where somebody else may have to take a look at your textures or work off of a file that you've been working on. So for your sake and for the sake of others, keeping an organized layer palette will make everyone's life easier. The first thing that I like to do when I'm setting up a texture is to block out the colors that are going to be used. In this case, because we are using mostly a single material to cover our object, in this case wood, the color that I start things off with should just be sort of a brown, wooden brown color. And I'll go ahead and put this into a group, which I will just simply name color. Now, some people may not use this step as they may want to jump straight into texturing, but when you get into more complex objects that have multiple materials associated with it, whether it be wood, leather, metal, all sorts of things, blocking things out at this early stage will make the more involving process of combining different materials that much more efficient later on. Before I do anything else, what I want to do is go ahead and save this scene as And instead of being in the images folder where it was by default, in source images, I'm going to go ahead and just call this crate. And I'm going to save it as a PSD. This will be my working file. And as well, from here I would like to save as. In this case, I'm going to use a PNG. Any sort of compressed file format will work, but I'll go ahead and name this crate_diffuse because what I'm going to be working on now is the diffuse map. As mentioned, not having the UV layout in here will make a better texture, so I will go ahead and overwrite that. At this point, we simply have a brown color on here, but as we improve our texture and we add more detail, once we have this hooked up, we can simply refresh the image and see what our changes have been. So in Maya, I'll go ahead and open up my Hypershade. And in my Hypershade, yours may look a little bit different from this, but I want to find the Create window here. I'm going to look under the Favorites tab under Maya, and I will bring up a Fong. Now, the Fong is useful because unlike a Lambert, which is the default material that Maya uses, Fongs have the ability to adjust specularity, or the shininess of the object. So I'll go ahead and I will apply this new material to my object, and just for keeping things organized, let's go ahead and rename this crate_mat for material. And for my crate material, I want to choose the color input, which, although there is a diffuse slot here, color is actually the default selection that we want to work with for our diffuse map, not the diffuse slider, which is a lighting-based input. So in here, I want to click this checker box to the right of it, which will bring up a window of things that I can place into this slot. In this case, I want to choose a file. This file will now show up over here on the right-hand side in my attribute editor, and I can choose a file which should default to my source images if I have my project set, and I will go ahead and choose this crate_diffuse.png. So for now, this is not a very interesting texture. If I go ahead and I hit 6 on the keyboard, it will render the texture as well as shaded. And let's go ahead and turn off my wireframe. So for now, this is not a very interesting looking crate, but we have all of the necessary basics set up to start working in Photoshop, save over this image, and refresh Maya to update what it looks like. Now I've gone ahead and I've moved my study crate off to the left so that as I'm working on things, I can use this as a reference to where I need to have my various boards laid out as I go on. At this point, I will need to acquire some photo-based textures to begin adding more detail than just the colors. In my case, because I'm working with a wooden crate, finding a good wooden texture is important. My suggestion is there are several sites online, such as textures.com, which allow you to download and use, even for commercial use, a nice library of high-quality photo textures. The one that I downloaded looks something like this. I looked for a texture that had a good wood grain to it, but also was not overly full of nails, as any nails that I put into my texture I want to do manually rather than having them lined up somewhere that doesn't make sense. And I tried to find a decent quality render here. This image here is 1024 by 1024, so even though this will be shrunk down and rearranged within my texture, I know that I will continue to have a good quality. Back in Photoshop, I can go ahead and open that image up, and I'm going to drag that over into the other scene. Bringing back up my UVs, I now have an idea of where things can line up. I'm going to go ahead and create myself a new group, which I will go ahead and call Boards because there will be a bunch of moving things around and rearranging them. But before I actually start doing so, taking a look at my model here, if I wanted to start off with this particular face, which I can see here is in my first section over here in the top left, it would correspond to the layout that I've made here, which would have a longer board across the top and the bottom, shorter boards across the sides, and as well the sides of the boards on the adjacent sides. So this is my visual reference for what things are going to look like. And in Photoshop, I can start sizing my boards appropriately. Now I'll go ahead and duplicate this original image just so that I have a full high quality version of it to work with in the background, and I will go ahead and start scaling things down appropriately. Now the size of my shapes here, my UV shells, are designed to be a certain width as far as boards go. So there is a little bit of an overlap to them. So I will make this just a bit smaller so that there's some room for the edges of boards to exist. But in here, this board along the top is about the size that I want it to be. Now, what I'm going to do is select this first board with my marquee tool, and in my layer palette, I'm going to create a layer mask to show only that section. The reason that I do this, especially with a tileable texture like the wood that I'm using, I can reuse this particular image over and over again, unhook the layer mask, and rearrange it so that I have a variety of wood grain so that I don't have repeating patterns all across my object. But starting things off like this gives me a very good ability to block things out where I need them to be. So thinking back to this board originally, I will line it up with the bottom here. Again, I will give myself another board along the top, which will be part of the lid. And I'm just holding Alt and dragging across to make more of these as I go. I'm going to use a little bit of layering here to put this behind that. And as I'm working for now, I'm going to just try to line things up with this first side. With doing this, I can reuse a lot of the layout that I do for this. So I'm going to take my time to get things right the first time. And back in Maya, I see that I also have some boards along the side here. So I'll go ahead and line something up with that as well. Now, as a quick test to see what's going on with this, I'll go ahead and save these out without my UV snapshot. Control-Shift-S to save as. I will overwrite my Create Diffuse. Okay. And back in Maya, if we take a look back at our Hypershade, I can right-click on my material, tell it to refresh swatch, and it will bring in the image as it now exists. So I do have some overlap into different shells, as you can see here, which I can clean up in a moment. But my goal for now is to try to get these things to line up nicely over here. So I might need to rearrange some of these boards, and I'll go back into Photoshop and do that. Now that I have my outer rim laid out correctly, let me go ahead and make the boards that are going to take up the back section of this. And one thing that I need to consider at this point is the interior faces that I extruded out previously. Now, along the top and the bottom, other than getting rid of this line here, I will also need to make sure that the wood grain for this board is going up and down in this direction and not just using the image from the back here. And to make sure that this lines up correctly, I'm going to go ahead and utilize my layer mask, and I'm going to make sure that the only section that's showing is inside of this space. I'm going to use my polygon lasso tool to select the area. I'm going to use Control-Shift-I to invert my selection, and I'm going to hit delete to make that section black, with black being the back color here. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other layer. Now that I'm happy with the layout for one of the sides of my crate, I can go ahead and start taking some variation into my design. So as I'm working, I have auto select turned on with the select tool so that I can just simply click on an object and move it at will rather than choosing a layer. And in here, what I'm going to do with my layer masks is click on the chain link to break the connection specifically between the position of my board and its layer mask. Because I have the layer mask positioned at where I want to be, and I have a variety of boards to actually work from, when moving one or the other, whether it be the layer or the layer mask, I can then realign this to get myself a different board. Once I'm happy with this, I can go ahead and reconnect the links to this, because if I end up duplicating this and moving it around, I want the layer masks to go with it. And finally, once I have this section of board set up, bringing back my UV layout to be a reference, I'm going to go ahead and select the area that this actually takes up, and I'm going to apply a layer mask to this group, which should crop it off nicely and leave my original images here if I need to edit them at all. So let's save this back out. And see how we're looking. Much nicer. Now that I have one side laid out, taking a look at my reference, the opposite side is the same layout, and given the fact that the viewer will never see the left side and the right side at the same time, reusing some of the same objects can really help sell the look of what we're doing. As well, we can reuse some of the pieces to make the front and the back here, though we will need to rearrange some of our boards. And as well, the top other than the lining up of the boards along the side, is almost essentially the same layout as the front and the back. And as I'm working, I want to take a look at how things line up with one another from one side to the other. So here I see that I need to actually line things up so that these edges meet one another as well on the bottom. Very nice. Now, there are some very slight misalignments here which can be tweaked later on, but now that I have this side of my crate, I can again use the same layout for the opposite side. And finally, to just do the top and the bottom. Taking some time to rearrange and reuse the board layouts that I had by creating 3 unique layouts, one for each of the opposite sides. I'm now left with a good rough layout of where all of my boards are going to be, taking into account where one shape goes from one side to the other. I'm keeping my overall object 3-dimensional in the construction based upon my original design. The last thing that I need to do is texture the support beams, and just as before, I will go ahead and take the board textures that I've been using and line it up accordingly to the rest of the UV space. And for now, this gives me the base layout for my crate all the way around. And we will continue from here to add extra detail in the next video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.